On this episode of the Pax Romana podcast, we look at the formative experiences of the man who would become Julian the Apostate, the last pagan Roman emperor. Why did he decide to go against the Christianity of his predecessors? How did he find himself in a position of power after barely escaping a purge which saw most of his family members killed? And why did the emperor who likely orchestrated those killings end up relying on him, even promoting him to the second highest position in the entire Roman Empire, that of Caesar? Julian the Apostate is one of my favorite emperors. His story is amazing. It is rich in part because we have great material from the historian Ammianus Marcellinus and also personal letters of Julian himself. So today we are going to look at the rise of this fascinating figure in the 4th century AD, Julian the Apostate, on this episode of the Pax Romana podcast. Episode 92, Julian the Apostate's Path to Power. This episode is going to overlap with a little bit of the details that we've talked about in the last couple of episodes, but we are going to focus on the perspective of Flavius Claudius Julianus, that is, the man also known as Julian the Apostate. He would only rule for a few years, 361 to 363 AD, but his story and his style is quite interesting. So Julian was born, if you remember from previous episodes, in 331 AD in Constantinople. This was the city that was founded by Constantine the Great as the new eastern capital of the Roman Empire. It was originally called Byzantium, a Greek city. And Julian was the son of a man named Julius Constantius. That man was half-brother to Constantine the Great. He was consul in 335 and then executed in the purges of 337 when Constantine the Great died, and his sons, or maybe just one of his sons, Constantius II, executed many male family members of the Constantine dynasty in an effort to secure sole rule of the Roman Empire. So Julian became acquainted with brutality and death very early on. By the way, his mother died before all of that. She didn't live to see her husband and other family members murdered. She died just shortly after Julian was born. But even after that year, 337, as we saw in previous episodes, the killing didn't stop. So the three surviving sons of Constantine ruled different thirds of the Roman Empire, and they ended up fighting with each other and also a usurper or two along the way, such that by the 350s AD, it was just Constantius II in charge. At that point, Constantius needed family members. Too bad he had executed so many of them, but he didn't have an heir. And the only two survivors of the purge that could work were the young men Gallus and Julian. So Gallus was the older half-brother of Julian, and he was the first one that Constantius appointed as Caesar, which was a kind of junior emperor, second in command of the Roman Empire. And this happened in 351 AD. But he only lasted a few years in this position. He was executed in 354. And at that point, Julian was the only possible heir left for the Emperor Constantius II. Well, what had Julian been doing all of that time, from the days after the purge to the point when he was finally appointed Caesar? He had spent a lot of his time in a kind of house arrest. There was a Christian bishop named Eusebius of Nicomedia. He was a key political supporter of Constantius, and he delivered a Christian upbringing to Julian and his older half-brother Gallus. He also protected them from the dark politics of the imperial court. And so Julian didn't have many other options other than to immerse himself in education. He studied Neoplatonism. This was the philosophical school founded by a philosopher named Plotinus in the 3rd century AD. Neoplatonism emphasized a kind of mystical union with a divine force that exists in the universe. And Julian also read classical literature. He had tutors, in addition to the Christian bishop, who taught him Homer and Hesiod and other Greek and Roman writers. And as a result, Julian began to secretly nurture pagan sympathies, even as the empire was becoming more Christian under Constantine's brothers. And it's not surprising either if we think about the fact that these Christian men had so many of Julian's family members executed. Makes sense that he might desire an alternative worldview than the one that animated the people who killed his family members. But there was no real way for Julian to practice non-Christian or pagan religion because in 341, Constantius banned pagan sacrifices. In 356, pagan temples were closed. Now, this was mostly in the cities. It was impossible to enforce these decrees in the countryside. And in fact, that's where the term pagan comes from. A pagus is a rural country person who practices the religion that was traditional in those places, i.e. not Christianity. And I'm sure that Julian was able to make some supervised, maybe even as he got older, some unsupervised trips out into rural settings where he would have encountered pagan priests and temples and rituals. And it's not as though there weren't intellectual voices arguing that Christianization of the Roman Empire posed problems for its safety, because if the old gods were not worshipped as they ought to have been, then there were still many Romans who were concerned that those gods would remove their protective authority. These are people like the senator Symmachus. So it's not that Julian was completely alone or without non-Christian intellectuals to look up to. These people were around for sure. Eventually, the bishop Eusebius died. And so in 342, the two brothers were relocated to an imperial estate in the province of Cappadocia. That's in central Anatolia, modern Turkey. And they spent 6 years there in a fairly luxurious palatial setting. There were gardens and springs on the property. Julian and his brother were well treated, even if they were captives. Christian tutors were brought in to further their Christian education, and even Constantius himself, the emperor of the East, and then eventually of the whole empire, made visits to the property and checked on his cousins. Then in 348, when Julian was a teenager, he and his brother were brought back to the capital. They were educated there in rhetoric and grammar and philosophy. And in Constantinople, Julian was able to attend lectures delivered by non-Christian philosophers like Libanius. And when Libanius taught in nearby Nicomedia, Julian hired scribes to copy the lectures so that he could read them later. Then in 351, Julian's half-brother Gallus was made Caesar. And this brought for Julian more mobility. He was able to leave the estates far more easily and travel to philosophical hubs across Asia Minor. He went to Pergamum and Ephesus, where he met with influential Neoplatonists. And so by the age of 20, he was firmly a non-Christian. But this was something that he kept hidden, only letting a select few know about his views. Much of this, by the way, is known through the letters of Julian himself. And he speaks of a kind of closeted paganism, where he maintained the appearance of Christian dedication on the outside, even serving in Nicomedia's church, but inside was unconvinced of Christianity's claims, finding Neoplatonism far more palatable. After a few years of doing this, tragedy struck Julian because in 354 AD, his brother was accused of treason and executed. Julian was then summoned to Constantius's court in Milan, and he was placed once again under close guard in a kind of detention in the nearby town of Comum, which is ancient Como in Italy. But there he developed a relationship with Constantius's wife, and she advocated for Julian, impressing upon her husband that he ought to have permission to go and study back in the East. And eventually he was allowed to go to Athens, really the center of philosophy and learning in the Roman world. This for Julian must have been a welcome trip, and he made the most of it. He forged bonds with philosophers like Priscus, who was a Neoplatonist philosopher. He underwent the sacred rites at Eleusis, which is an ancient Greek sanctuary near Athens, the site of the Eleusinian Mysteries, a very old set of religious rites in ancient Greece. They date all the way back to the Bronze Age, maybe even earlier. So this was a huge deal for Julian. Then in 355 AD, we get the thing that we talked about in the last episode, the uprising of Silvanus in Gaul, a direct rebellion against the Emperor Constantius, which forced the emperor to draw upon Julian, the only possible heir he could find, as a new Caesar. And so Julian ended his education in November of 355. He married Constantius's sister, Helena, as a way to tie him to the emperor, and he was sent to the west to reassert the dynasty's power across the Roman Empire, with special focus on Gaul, a province which had been the source of major rebellions and also incursions of tribes like the Franks and the Alemanni. Julian arrived in Vienne, which is modern Vienna, with a very small retinue and just a few hundred soldiers. But Julian was very talented, and he was able to raise thousands of soldiers in the area and recapture many of the cities that had either rejected Constantius II or were under siege by Alemanni and Franks. And he was very much alone in these efforts. Constantius had to deal with the Persians, who had begun encroaching on Rome's eastern border, and Julian was left to himself in the west. The main tribes that Julian had to fight were the Franks, and these were a confederation that emerged around the 3rd century AD along the Lower Rhine in the Roman province of Germania Inferior. And the Franks were sometimes raiders of Roman cities and forts, and then at other times, Rome was able to secure alliances. They were an opportunistic people. They sacked the Roman city of Trier in 275, and Constantine the Great had fought them in 308 and even executed a few of their kings. The Alemanni, which sounds a lot like all men, and that may be what the term means, was more of a larger confederation of Germanic tribes. Those tribes came from the Upper Rhine River, from southwestern Germany, from Switzerland, from Alsace, and they show up in Roman records all the way back in the early 3rd century. Caracalla had to deal with them. In fact, he even massacred them, which, as we know from earlier episodes in the podcast, Caligula was a big fan of massacres. But over the 3rd century and then into the early 4th century, the Alemanni had gained in strength, and they had effectively overrun the Roman frontier between the Rhine and the Danube, and the Romans had basically abandoned it because they couldn't secure it. A little less than 2 years after reaching this terrorized and war-torn region, Julian fought a pivotal battle that won him a lot of glory, the Battle of Argentoratum, or the Battle of Strasbourg, in the late summer of 357 AD. And we know a lot about this battle because Ammianus Marcellinus tells us about it. He was a soldier who served under Julian. This was a battle against the Alemanni, led by 7 of their kings with a troop strength of around 35,000. Julian had recruited well in the region, but he did not have anything close to that. He might have had 12 or 13,000 troops, so about a third of what his opponents had. And in fact, many of his soldiers were Germanic and Celtic peoples, and he had to take them to get to the battle on a 21-mile march. But Julian had taught his soldiers Roman tactics, which he knew well from study. The Roman soldiers formed a solid shield-locked line. Their cavalry was massed on the right, and when the Alemanni advanced, Julian delivered a speech to his infantry and raised a purple dragon standard, which stabilized his soldiers, delivered crucial morale. The Alemannic kings decided to dismount and lead sword charges, but the Romans stayed disciplined and actually formed a testudo formation in which they locked their shields along the sides and also overhead to create a kind of impenetrable tortoise shell. The Alemanni were unable to kill enough Romans and eventually cracked. They fled and panicked, flinging themselves into the Rhine River. The kings that did not die surrendered, and when the final toll of the battle was counted, only a few hundred Roman soldiers and a handful of officers had been killed. The Alemanni, however, lost around 6,000 men on the field, and then many others drowned in the Rhine. And with this victory, Julian was able to press further into enemy territory. He crossed the Rhine in 358 AD and sacked Alemannic villages. They found an old Roman fort that was built under Trajan, which they rebuilt, and eventually was able to secure a truce with the Alemanni. Julian then turned to the Franks, taking his army through their territory, besieging their forts and settlements, accepting surrenders right and left. He even found some Roman prisoners of war that he was able to free. He found supplies of food that he was able to donate to his soldiers. And then in 359 AD, he reached the city of Paris. And in Paris, he became a kind of administrative figure in the West. He looked into the tributes that were being collected, finding discrepancies among his own people and punishing corruption. He found signs of embezzlement by one of his governors. He sent spies out to check on other officials to see if they were doing their jobs, and some of them weren't, and Julian punished them. Julian also had funds diverted to rebuild many of the Roman cities on the Rhine. He erected granaries. By the end of the year 359, Julian had enacted a series of reforms and had won many victories, transforming him from a Caesar who had been sent to the region with very little into an almost savior-like figure to the Romans in that area. Now, Constantius II had obviously heard about what Julian was doing, and you would think that he would be pleased, but according to Ammianus Marcellinus, he was not. He became resentful and jealous. He was concerned about the growing independence of his Caesar and the loyalty that Julian commanded among local military leaders and even some of Rome's former enemies. And because Julian had rooted out some corruption, there were plenty of Roman officials and former governors and prefects who were willing to travel to Constantinople to claim that Julian was undermining Constantius there. And so, perhaps as a test of loyalty, Constantius demanded that Julian send soldiers from the west over to Constantius so that Constantius could better fight the Persian king Shapur. This all happened in February of 360. And Constantius did not want just a few soldiers. He wanted about half of Julian's army. This was obviously about more than just reinforcements and even a loyalty test. Constantius wanted Julian weakened to the point where he could barely govern Gaul, and that was it. When word reached Paris that many of the soldiers there would need to leave and be deployed in a war very far from their homeland, they decided to hail Julian as Augustus, emperor of the entire Roman Empire. Supposedly, Julian played this down, urging the soldiers to comply. In the end, he demanded all of the soldiers assemble just outside the city of Paris, where he would tell them personally what it was that they needed to do. Yet that night, there was a rebellion. The soldiers around Paris besieged Julian's quarters, acclaiming him emperor, shouting, demanding that he take up the position of Augustus. They brought a crown for him, and each man supposedly found a pound of silver to donate to this emperor. In one of his letters, Julian says what he did in that moment. Quote, "I prayed to Zeus. He showed me a sign and bade me yield and not oppose myself to the will of the army. Nevertheless, even after these tokens had been vouchsafed to me, I did not yield without reluctance, but resisted as long as I could, and would not accept either the salutation or the crown. But since I could not single-handed control so many, and moreover the gods who willed that this should happen, spurred on the soldiers and gradually softened my resolution. Somewhere about the 3rd hour of the night, some soldier or other gave me the collar, and I put it on my head and returned to the palace, as the gods know, groaning in my heart. And yet surely it was my duty to feel confidence and to trust in the God after he had shown me the sign, but I was terribly ashamed and ready to sink into the earth at the thought of not seeming to obey Constantius faithfully to the last. That's Julian's own words in his letter to the Athenians. The letter is fascinating. It speaks of a kind of divine inevitability. Julian attributes his rise, his decision to accept this role as the will of the gods. It was not personal ambition. Elsewhere, Julian speaks of even seeing a sign from Zeus, a kind of halo in the sky, which he interpreted as a sign of the favor of Apollo. There are obvious crossovers here with Constantine's vision, a vision which he used to refound the Roman Empire as a Christian empire. And it's no surprise that Julian, as a non-Christian, had a similar religious experience that he used to justify undoing the Christianization of the empire. I don't know what Julian really saw or what he really thought. We have his own words, and those are important to be sure. I also think that we can see in this episode, this usurpation, a pretty classic late Roman usurpation. There is soldier discontent. There is a candidate for emperor far away from the legitimate emperor, and Julian even stages a kind of reluctance to be emperor. These are all elements that are very common in such usurpations. So Julian took up the appointment as Augustus and rebelled directly against his emperor Constantius II. Some of the soldiers had already started going east. He sent word to have them recalled. His army was kept intact. He instituted a wave of promotion, putting in his loyal supporters in officer positions, and removed some of the appointments that Constantius had made. Julian stayed in the West. So in the summer of 360, he launched a 3-month campaign against the Franks, eventually wintering in Vienna. There, Julian held games, and he openly donned the regalia of a Roman Augustus. And although Julian was now openly usurping his emperor, he was not yet an open pagan. He actually publicly observed Epiphany in January of 361, acting as a Christian ruler. Epiphany, by the way, commemorates the visit of the Magi to the infant Jesus. Again, back in the East, Constantius heard about all of this. And although the two men had been sending correspondence back and forth, eventually Constantius realized he needed to do something about Julian and confront him directly. In 361, Julian moved further east, both fighting battles, but also stopping in cities to host races and games and festivities. But then Julian had a problem back behind him. The city of Aquileia in northern Italy rebelled against him, as 2 legions there declared for Constantius, as well as the civilians in the city and the city councilors. And Constantius from the east had left the campaign against Shapur and the Persians and began marching to the west towards Julian's army. So in a sense, Julian was surrounded. He sent out letters to cities like Athens and Corinth. He sent a letter back to Rome, defending his actions and asking for the support of those cities. As Constantius continued to move west and gather soldiers for the confrontation, he ended up catching a bug of some kind. And by bug, I mean illness. Eventually, he couldn't travel. And by October, he realized that he was dying. Constantius was not an old man. He was about 44, maybe 45 years old. But if he was going to die, he had a decision to make. And in the end, he decided to preserve the fragile unity of his empire. His enemy, Julian, the man whose family Constantius had likely killed, and who was in active rebellion against Constantius, well, Constantius, on his deathbed, made Julian his official heir and successor. And so there was no confrontation and no battle. because on November the 3rd, Constantius would die. And Julian learned of the death and realized that he had the blessing of Constantius II and therefore entered Constantinople on December 11th, 361, not as a conqueror or as a usurper, but as the legitimate and sole emperor of the entire Roman Empire. He would go on to reign for just 20 months, in a reign that would be richly documented by Ammianus Marcellinus and also Julian's own letters. Commentary that is philosophical, satirical, and also full of information about what Julian did and why he did it. And so as a result, we're able to understand that although Julian's reign would be a short one, it was also fascinating, because Julian would openly declare himself a pagan and would attempt to reverse the Christianization of the Roman Empire that had been gaining steam over the last few decades. How would Julian rule as a pagan in a Christian world? Was he successful in doing so? And how did he meet his end? We will talk about those questions on the next episode of the Pax Romana podcast.
Thanks for listening to the Pax Romana podcast. For more information, including a list of primary sources and further reading, check the show notes. Music by Red Productions and Exocor. Follow Professor Colin Elliott on X at ProfCPE or email colin@paxromanapodcast.com. Listen to more episodes on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or just about anywhere podcasts are available. Stay tuned for the next episode of the Pax Romana podcast.